Tommy pressed his back against the cold brick wall, trying to make himself invisible as people walked by without even looking at him. The morning air cut through his thin jacket like ice, and he pulled his knees closer to his chest, hoping to trap whatever warmth his small body could create. His stomach made another angry growl, reminding him that it had been 2 whole days since his last real meal. The doorway of the old Miller's hardware store had become his temporary home after the youth shelter told him they were full again. At 12 years old, Tommy had learned that being small and quiet meant you got overlooked, which sometimes was good and sometimes was terrible. Today it felt terrible because overlooked meant no food, no help, and no hope. He clutched the crinkled plastic grocery bag closer to his chest. Inside were the only things in the world that still belonged to him. Most people probably thought it was trash, but to Tommy, that bag held everything that mattered. He'd protected it through 3 different shelters, 2 nights sleeping in the park, and countless hours walking the streets with nowhere to go. The morning rush was starting, and Tommy watched as men and women in expensive clothes hurried past him to catch buses or jump into their cars. Their shoes clicked against the sidewalk in a rhythm that spoke of purpose and places to be. He wondered what it felt like to have somewhere important to go, to have people waiting for you, to matter to someone. A woman in a bright red coat walked by talking loudly on her phone about some meeting she was late for. She was so focused on her conversation that she almost stepped on Tommy's outstretched feet. He quickly pulled them back, not wanting to cause any trouble. The last thing he needed was someone calling the police again. His throat was dry and scratchy. The water fountain at the park had been broken for weeks, and buying even a small bottle of water meant choosing between being thirsty or being hungry later. Tommy had learned to make these impossible choices every single day. Today, hunger was winning the battle. As he sat there, Tommy noticed a man walking toward a shiny black car parked right across the street. The man was talking on his phone, gesturing with his free hand while balancing a brown leather briefcase under his arm. He looked like the kind of person who had never worried about where his next meal would come from. His suit probably cost more than most people made in a month. Tommy watched as the man fumbled with his car keys while still talking on the phone. The briefcase started to slip and the man juggled it awkwardly, trying to hold everything at once. Then it happened. The briefcase fell to the ground with a soft thud, and papers scattered in the morning breeze. The man was completely oblivious. He got into his car, still talking on his phone, still gesturing. He started the engine and began to pull away from the curb. Tommy could see the briefcase lying there on the sidewalk, abandoned and forgotten. Some of the papers were already blowing down the street. For a moment, Tommy just sat there watching the car drive away. His mind raced through possibilities. The briefcase looked expensive. Really expensive. There might be money inside. Credit cards. Maybe even cash. Nobody would know if he just walked over and took it. The man was already gone. Probably wouldn't even realize he'd lost it until much later. Tommy's stomach growled again, more insistently this time. With whatever money might be in that briefcase, he could buy food. Real food. Maybe even find a cheap motel room for a night where he could take a shower and sleep in an actual bed instead of on concrete. But then another voice in his head spoke up. It sounded like his mother's voice, soft but firm. She'd always told him that doing the right thing wasn't about what was easy or what would benefit him. It was about who he chose to be when nobody was looking. Tommy looked down at his plastic bag. Inside, along with his few precious possessions, was a letter his mother had written to him just before she died. He'd read it so many times that some of the ink was starting to fade, but he remembered every word. She'd written about being proud of him, about knowing he would grow up to be a good man, about how character was the only thing nobody could ever take away from you. The black car was getting smaller in the distance, but Tommy could still see it. If he really ran, he might be able to catch up to it at the next red light. His legs were skinny and he hadn't eaten much, but desperation had a way of giving you strength you didn't know you had. Tommy made his choice. He grabbed his plastic bag and jumped to his feet. His legs felt shaky at first, but he pushed through the weakness and started running down the sidewalk. The briefcase was heavier than he'd expected, and the scattered papers kept trying to fly away, but he managed to gather most of them up as he ran. People stared at him as he sprinted down the street. A homeless kid carrying an expensive briefcase and chasing after a luxury car probably looked pretty suspicious, but Tommy didn't care what they thought. He had to catch that car. The traffic light ahead turned red just as Tommy had hoped. The black car was third in line, trapped behind two other vehicles. Tommy's chest burned and his legs felt like rubber, but he pushed harder, running faster than he'd ever run in his life. He reached the car just as the light was turning green. Tommy banged on the driver's side window, gasping for breath and holding up the briefcase. The man inside looked startled, maybe even scared. A dirty kid suddenly appearing at your car window would probably frighten anyone. But Tommy held up the briefcase higher and pointed to it, trying to show the man what had happened. He saw recognition dawn on the man's face as he realized what he'd almost lost. The expensive car pulled over to the side of the road, and the man got out. Tommy stood there on the sidewalk, still breathing hard, still clutching his plastic bag in one hand and holding out the briefcase with the other. He'd made his choice. Instead of taking what wasn't his, he'd chosen to give back what belonged to someone else. His mother would have been proud, even though it meant he'd still go to bed hungry tonight. The man looked at Tommy with an expression that seemed to mix surprise, gratitude, and something else Tommy couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the beginning of understanding. Maybe it was the first spark of something that would change both their lives forever. But Tommy didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that he'd done the right thing, even when the wrong thing would have been so much easier. The man who stepped out of the black car was nothing like Tommy had expected up close. Sure, his suit was expensive and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine, but his eyes weren't cold or mean like some rich people Tommy had encountered. Instead, they looked surprised, maybe even a little guilty. You brought this back to me?" the man asked, staring at the briefcase in Tommy's outstretched hands. His voice carried a slight accent that Tommy couldn't place, but it wasn't unfriendly. Tommy nodded, still catching his breath from the sprint down 3 city blocks. "You dropped it by your car, sir. I saw you drive away, so I ran after you." He held the briefcase out further, wanting to get this over with before the man started asking questions he didn't want to answer. But instead of just taking the briefcase and leaving, the man studied Tommy's face carefully. Tommy shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny, very aware of how he must look. His hair hadn't been properly washed in over a week. His clothes had stains he couldn't even remember getting. His sneakers had holes that let in every drop of rain and every gust of cold air. "What's your name, son?" the man asked gently. "Tommy." He almost added "sir" again, but stopped himself. His mother had taught him to be polite, but she'd also taught him that respect was something that should go both ways. "I'm David," the man said, extending his hand for a shake. Tommy hesitated for just a moment before reaching out with his free hand. David's grip was firm but not crushing, and he didn't pull his hand away quickly like some people did when they realized Tommy probably wasn't as clean as they'd like. "Tommy, do you have any idea what's in this briefcase?" David asked, taking it carefully and clutching it against his chest. Tommy shook his head. "No, sir. I mean, David, I didn't look inside. That wouldn't be right." David's eyebrows rose slightly. "You didn't even peek?" "Not even a little bit?" "No." Tommy's voice was quiet but steady. "It's not mine." For a long moment, David just stared at him. Cars honked as they drove around the luxury vehicle parked awkwardly by the curb. But David didn't seem to notice. Finally, he spoke again. "Tommy, this briefcase contains contracts for a business deal worth more money than most people see in their entire lives. If I hadn't gotten it back," he trailed off, shaking his head, "let's just say you probably saved my career today." Tommy didn't really know what to say to that, so he just nodded. He was starting to feel dizzy from hunger and the adrenaline crash after his sprint. All he wanted now was to find a quiet place to sit down and maybe sip some water from a public fountain, if he could find one that worked. "Have you eaten today, Tommy?" The question came out of nowhere and hit Tommy like a punch to the gut. Not because it was mean, but because it was asked with such genuine concern that Tommy felt his eyes start to burn with tears he absolutely could not let fall. "I'm okay," he said automatically. It was what he always said. It was easier than explaining that he hadn't eaten in 2 days, that he'd been turned away from 3 different food kitchens because they were either closed or full, that he'd been considering digging through dumpsters behind restaurants but couldn't quite bring himself to do it yet. David looked at him for another long moment, and Tommy had the uncomfortable feeling that this man could see right through his lie. "There's a diner just 2 blocks from here," David said finally. "Good food, reasonable prices. Would you join me for lunch?" Tommy's stomach chose that exact moment to let out a growl so loud that both of them heard it clearly. Tommy felt his face burn with embarrassment. "I don't have any money," he admitted quietly. I didn't ask if you had money. Tommy, I asked if you'd join me for lunch. David's voice was kind but serious. After what you just did for me, buying you a meal is the least I can do. Every instinct Tommy had developed over the past 6 months told him to be suspicious. Adults didn't just buy street kids meals out of kindness. There was always a catch, always something they wanted in return. But something about David felt different. Maybe it was the way he'd shaken Tommy's hand like he was a real person instead of just a problem to be solved or avoided. "Okay," Tommy said finally, "but I can't stay long." David smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Tommy had seen directed at him in months. "Fair enough. We'll make it quick." They walked the 2 blocks together, and Tommy noticed that David adjusted his pace to match Tommy's shorter legs without making it obvious. When they reached Murphy's Diner, a small place with checkered floors and red vinyl booths, David held the door open and let Tommy go first. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, looked up when they entered. Tommy saw her eyes take in his appearance, then shift to David in his expensive suit, and he could practically see her trying to figure out what these 2 very different people were doing together. "Just the 2 of you today?" she asked, grabbing 2 menus. "Yes, ma'am," David replied. "Could we get a booth in the back? Somewhere quiet?" She led them to a corner booth with cracked red seats and a wobbly table that someone had stabilized with a folded napkin under one leg. Tommy slid into the seat facing the door, a habit he'd developed since living on the streets. Always know where the exits are. Always be ready to run. David sat across from him and immediately pushed one of the menus toward Tommy. "Order whatever you want, Tommy. I mean it. Whatever sounds good." Tommy opened the menu and felt overwhelmed. There were so many choices. So many things he'd dreamed about eating during the long, hungry nights: pancakes, burgers, soup, sandwiches. Real food made by real people in a real kitchen. "The meatloaf is really good here," the waitress said, noticing Tommy's indecision. Her voice was gentle, like she'd seen kids like him before and understood. "Comes with mashed potatoes and green beans." "Very filling." Tommy nodded gratefully. "That sounds perfect. Make it 2, David told the waitress. "And could we get some coffee?" "Hot chocolate for Tommy if you have it." As the waitress walked away, David leaned forward slightly. "So Tommy, I have to ask, where are your parents? Shouldn't you be in school right now?" Tommy's hand tightened instinctively on the plastic bag he'd kept beside him in the booth. "It's complicated," he said quietly. "Most things worth talking about are," David replied. "But I'm a good listener if you want to share." Tommy studied David's face, looking for signs of judgment or pity or the fake concern that adults sometimes showed when they wanted to feel better about themselves. But all he saw was genuine interest and patience. "My mom died 6 months ago," Tommy said finally. "Car accident. I don't have anybody else." David's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Tommy. That must be incredibly difficult." "The state tried to place me with foster families," Tommy continued, surprised to find the words coming easier than he'd expected. "But it never worked out. Some people just want the government money. Others couldn't handle a kid who wasn't used to their rules. I kept running away. And now I take care of myself." Tommy lifted his chin slightly, trying to look more confident than he felt. The food arrived then, interrupting their conversation. Tommy tried to eat slowly to make it last, but his body had other ideas. He was hungrier than he'd realized, and the meatloaf was better than anything he'd tasted in months. David ate his own meal thoughtfully, occasionally asking gentle questions about Tommy's life, never pushing when Tommy didn't want to answer. As they talked, Tommy found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in months. David didn't treat him like a charity case or a problem. He treated him like a person. "That bag," David said eventually, nodding toward the plastic grocery bag Tommy kept close beside him. "It seems important to you." Tommy's hand moved protectively to the bag. "It has my stuff in it." "Your stuff?" Tommy hesitated, then nodded. "Things from my mom. Things that matter." David didn't ask to look inside, didn't push for details. He just nodded like he understood that some things were too precious and too personal to share with strangers. Even kind ones who bought you lunch. As they finished eating, Tommy found himself wondering if this was what having a father felt like. After they finished eating, David didn't immediately get up to leave like Tommy expected. Instead, he ordered another cup of coffee and settled back in the booth like he had all the time in the world. Tommy wasn't used to adults who weren't in a hurry to get away from him. "Tommy," David said carefully, stirring sugar into his coffee. "I've been thinking about what you did today, returning that briefcase when you could have easily kept it or sold it. That took real character." Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not from successful adults who looked like they stepped out of magazine advertisements. "Most kids your age, especially kids in your situation, might have made a different choice," David continued. "What made you decide to chase after me?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously moving to touch the plastic bag beside him. "My mom always said that who you are when nobody's watching is who you really are," he said finally. "She said it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. What matters is whether you can look at yourself in the mirror and be okay with what you see. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was." Tommy's voice got softer. "She worked 2 jobs to take care of me. Cleaned offices at night and worked at a grocery store during the day. She was always tired, but she never complained." "Not once." David leaned forward slightly. "You miss her a lot." It wasn't really a question, but Tommy nodded anyway. "Every single day. Sometimes I wake up and for just a second I forget she's gone. I think I'm going to hear her making breakfast in the kitchen or humming while she gets ready for work. Then I remember, and it's like losing her all over again." The waitress came by to refill David's coffee, and Tommy noticed how she smiled at him warmly now, not with the suspicious look she'd given him when they first walked in. Food and kindness had a way of making people see you differently. "That bag you carry," David said after the waitress left. "It's not just clothes and supplies, is it?" Tommy's hand moved protectively to the worn plastic bag. He'd been carrying it for 6 months now through shelters and streets, keeping it close even when he slept. Some of the kids he'd met on the streets had laughed at him for carrying around what looked like garbage, but Tommy didn't care what they thought. "No," he admitted quietly. "It's not clothes." David waited patiently, not pushing or demanding answers like some adults did. He just sat there drinking his coffee and giving Tommy space to decide what he wanted to share. Tommy looked around the diner. Most of the lunch crowd had cleared out and their corner booth felt private and safe. The waitress was wiping down tables on the other side of the restaurant, humming softly to herself. For the first time in months, Tommy felt like he was somewhere he could breathe. "Do you really want to know?" Tommy asked. "Only if you want to tell me," David replied. "But yes, I'd like to know what's so important that you've been protecting it all this time." Tommy took a deep breath and carefully lifted the plastic bag onto the table. It was a simple grocery bag from Peterson's Market, the kind his mom used to bring home when she stopped for milk or bread after work. The handles were stretched and one corner had a small tear, but Tommy had been careful to keep it intact. "These are from my mom," he said, opening the bag slowly. "Everything I have left of her." The first thing he pulled out was a small stack of envelopes, maybe 15 or 20 letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was slightly yellowed and some of the ink had smudged from handling, but Tommy treated them like they were made of gold. "She wrote me letters," Tommy explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "When she was at work, sometimes she'd write me little notes and leave them on my pillow or in my lunchbox. After she died, I found a whole box of them under her bed, letters she'd written but never given me." David's eyes softened as he watched Tommy handle the letters with reverence. "What do they say?" "All kinds of things. Some are funny stories about customers at the grocery store. Some are advice about school or friends. Some are just—" Tommy paused, trying to find the right words. "Some are just her telling me she loves me and that she's proud of me." He set the letters aside carefully and reached into the bag again, pulling out a small photo album with a cracked plastic cover. The kind you could buy at any drugstore for a few dollars, but to Tommy it was priceless. "Pictures," he said, opening the album to show David. "This is us at the park when I was 7. This one's from my last birthday. Mom saved up for weeks to buy me that bicycle." David leaned forward to look at the photos, and Tommy saw genuine interest in his eyes, not the polite fake attention that some adults gave when kids showed them things. In the pictures, Tommy looked younger and happier, his face round with childhood and his smile bright and carefree. His mother was a small woman with kind eyes and dark hair that she wore pulled back in a practical ponytail. In every photo, she was looking at Tommy like he was the most precious thing in the world. "She was beautiful," David said softly. "You look like her around the eyes." Tommy smiled, the first real smile David had seen from him. "People always said that. She used to joke that I got her eyes, but thankfully got someone else's height, because she was barely 5 feet tall. The next item from the bag made David's breath catch. It was a small notebook, the kind with a marble pattern cover that students used in school. But this one was different. The pages were filled with drawings and poems written in Tommy's careful handwriting. "I draw sometimes," Tommy said, suddenly embarrassed. "And write. Mom always said I was good at it, but she was probably just being nice because she was my mom." "May I?" David asked, gesturing toward the notebook. Tommy hesitated for just a moment, then handed it over. David opened it carefully, treating it with the same respect Tommy had shown the letters. The first page had a drawing of a woman standing at a kitchen sink, her hair in a ponytail, looking over her shoulder with a smile. Even with just a regular pencil, Tommy had captured something warm and loving about her expression. "Tommy, this is incredible," David said, genuinely amazed. "You drew this?" Tommy nodded, his cheeks turning red. "That's her making Sunday morning pancakes. She always made them in the shape of animals. Mine were usually supposed to be elephants, but they looked more like blobs." David turned the page and found a poem titled "Night Shift." It was about watching his mother get ready for work, how she'd kiss his forehead before leaving, and how he'd fall asleep listening for her key in the door when she came home. The words were simple but powerful, filled with love and longing. "You wrote this?" "Yeah. After she died, I started writing things down. Things I remembered about her. Things I wanted to tell her but couldn't anymore. It helped somehow." David continued turning pages, finding drawing after drawing and poem after poem. Pictures of their small apartment, their cat Mr. Whiskers, who had to go to Tommy's neighbor when his mom died, the view from their kitchen window. Poems about missing her voice, about being scared, about trying to be brave because that's what she would have wanted. One drawing showed Tommy and his mother sitting on a park bench, sharing an ice cream cone. The poem on the opposite page was about how she always gave him the bigger half and pretended she liked the cone better than the ice cream anyway. "She did that with everything," Tommy said, noticing what David was reading. "If we only had enough food for one good meal, she'd make sure I got it and tell me she'd eaten at work. If I was cold, she'd give me her jacket and say she was too warm anyway. She always put me first, even when it meant she went without." David closed the notebook carefully and handed it back to Tommy. His eyes looked suspiciously bright, and he cleared his throat before speaking. "Tommy, your mother raised an extraordinary young man. And these drawings, these poems, you have real talent. I mean that." Tommy carefully packed everything back into the plastic bag, making sure each item was secure. "The social workers said I should let go of the past and focus on my future. They said carrying around old memories wasn't healthy. But these aren't just memories. They're proof that someone loved me. They're proof that I mattered to someone. They're absolutely right to be important to you," David said firmly. "And anyone who tells you to throw away your mother's love doesn't understand what real treasure looks like." As Tommy sealed the bag and set it beside him again, David found himself thinking about his own life. He had millions of dollars, expensive cars, a penthouse apartment with a view of the city, but he'd never had anyone write him poems or draw pictures of him with such obvious love. He'd never had anyone sacrifice for him the way Tommy's mother had sacrificed for her son. "Tommy," David said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "What would you say if I told you that meeting you today might have changed my life just as much as it changed yours?" Tommy looked confused. "What do you mean?" David smiled, but it was a different kind of smile now. It was the smile of a man who had just realized that the most valuable thing he'd found that day wasn't in his recovered briefcase. "I mean," David said, "that maybe it's time for both of us to start thinking about the future. Together." Tommy stared at David across the diner table, trying to understand what he'd just heard. "Together? What do you mean, together?" David took a sip of his coffee, clearly thinking about how to explain what was going through his mind. The diner was nearly empty now, just them and an elderly man reading a newspaper by the window, and the quiet afternoon light streaming through the windows made everything feel almost dreamlike. "Tommy, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer," David said. "If you could have anything in the world right now, anything at all, what would it be?" Tommy didn't have to think long. "I'd want my mom back. I know you would. But besides that, something that might actually be possible. What would you want?" Tommy looked down at his hands, fidgeting with a paper napkin. "I guess I'd want to not be scared all the time. I'd want to wake up somewhere warm and know I could stay there. I'd want to go to school again without worrying about where I'm going to sleep that night or if I'll have food for lunch. He paused. And I'd want someone who cared if I came home. David nodded slowly. What if I told you that I could help make those things happen? I'd say you don't really know me, Tommy replied quietly, and that people don't usually help kids like me unless they want something back. The honesty in Tommy's voice hit David like a punch to the chest. This 12-year-old boy had learned to be suspicious of kindness because the world had taught him that adults couldn't be trusted. It made David angry at a system that had failed this child so completely. You're right to be careful, David said. Smart kids who've been through what you've been through learn to protect themselves. But Tommy, what if I told you that you already gave me something more valuable than anything I could give you back? What could I have possibly given you? I don't have anything. David leaned forward, his voice becoming more serious. You gave me back my faith in people. When I saw you running down that street with my briefcase, my first thought was that you were trying to steal it. I've been dealing with business people for so long, people who would sell their grandmother for the right price, that I'd forgotten there were still honest people in the world. Tommy looked skeptical. That doesn't seem like much. It's everything, Tommy. In my line of work, I meet people every day who have everything they could want, but they'd step on their own mother to get a little more. You had nothing, were desperate and hungry, and you still chose to do the right thing. Do you have any idea how rare that is? The waitress came over with the check, and David handed her his credit card without even looking at the amount. Tommy noticed this and filed it away as more evidence of how different their worlds were. Here's what I'm thinking, David continued after the waitress left. I've got a big house with way too many empty rooms. I've got more money than I know what to do with, but I go to bed every night knowing I haven't really made a difference in anyone's life. You need a home, a family, a chance to use those talents I saw in your drawings and writing? Tommy's eyes widened. Are you saying? I'm saying I'd like to become your legal guardian, Tommy. I want to give you a real home, get you back in school, help you develop your artistic abilities. I want to be the person who cares if you come home. For a long moment, Tommy just stared at him. Then he started shaking his head. No, that's impossible. People don't just... You can't just... Why not? Because things like that don't happen to kids like me. Tommy's voice rose slightly, drawing a glance from the man with the newspaper. Rich people don't just adopt homeless kids they met on the street. That's not how the real world works. David reached across the table and gently placed his hand over Tommy's. Tommy, look at me. What happened today? A homeless kid chased down a rich businessman to return something that didn't belong to him. Does that sound like how the real world usually works? Tommy was quiet, considering this. Sometimes the real world surprises us, David continued. Sometimes good things happen to people who deserve them. And Tommy, if anyone deserves a second chance, it's you. But you don't know me, Tommy protested. What if I'm not who you think I am? What if I disappoint you? What if you don't? David interrupted gently. Tommy, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be yourself. The same boy who wrote those beautiful poems about his mother. The same kid who returned a briefcase full of contracts worth millions of dollars because it was the right thing to do. Tommy looked down at his plastic bag, his most precious possessions contained in something most people would throw away without a second thought. What about my stuff? My mom's letters and pictures? That bag and everything in it would come with you, of course. In fact, I'd like to help you preserve those letters and photos properly. Get them framed, maybe put together a real photo album. Those memories of your mother should be treasured, not hidden away in a grocery bag. For the first time since David had made his offer, Tommy looked genuinely interested. You'd do that? Of course. Tommy, your mother's love for you is obvious in every letter you showed me, every photo we looked at. That love helped shape you into the person you are today. I would never want to take that away from you. Tommy was quiet for several minutes, and David could practically see the thoughts racing through his mind. Hope warring with fear. The desire for security fighting against the learned mistrust of adults who made big promises. If I said yes, Tommy finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, what would you want from me? I'd want you to go back to school and give it your best effort. I'd want you to continue developing your artistic talents. And most importantly, I'd want you to stay the same good person your mother raised you to be. That's not negotiable, Tommy. Character isn't something you can compromise on. That's it? Just school and being good? David smiled. Just school and being good. though I have a feeling both of those things will be more challenging than you realize right now." Tommy looked around the diner, at the normal people living their normal lives, people who had homes to go to and families who loved them. He thought about his mother and what she would want for him. He thought about sleeping in doorways and being hungry, and wondering if anyone in the world would care if he just disappeared one day. "Can I ask you something?" Tommy said. "Anything. Why me?" "You could help any kid. You could donate money to charities or volunteer at schools. Why would you want to take on a homeless kid with no family?" David was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer honestly. "Because, Tommy, I've spent my whole adult life building a business, making money, accumulating things. But I've never built a family. I've never invested in another person's future. When I saw you today, when I heard your story and saw your art, I realized that you're not just a kid who needs help. You're a kid worth investing in. You're a kid who could do amazing things with the right support." He paused, then continued. "And maybe, just maybe, you could teach an old businessman something about what really matters in life." Tommy looked down at his hands, then back up at David. The fear was still there in his eyes, but so was something else now. Hope. "If I mess up," Tommy said slowly, "if I can't be what you want me to be, then we'll figure it out together," David said firmly. "That's what families do, Tommy. They don't give up on each other." The word family hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Tommy took a deep breath, clutched his plastic bag a little tighter, and made the second life-changing decision of his day. "Okay," he said quietly. "Yes, I want to try." David's face broke into a smile bigger than any Tommy had seen all day. "Really?" "Really. But I keep my mom's things, always." "Always," David agreed. "They're part of who you are." As they stood up to leave the diner, Tommy felt something he hadn't felt in 6 months. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was going home. 2 years had passed since that life-changing afternoon at Murphy's Diner, and Tommy could hardly recognize the boy he used to be. As he stood in front of the bathroom mirror in David's house, adjusting his tie for the scholarship ceremony at Riverside Academy, he thought about how much everything had changed. The house that had felt impossibly huge and intimidating when he first walked through its doors now felt like home. His room on the second floor had large windows that let in morning sunlight, bookshelves filled with novels and art supplies, and a desk where he did his homework every night. But the most important thing in the room sat on his nightstand in a beautiful wooden frame that David had specially made. It was his mother's last letter to him, the one that said she was proud of the man he would become. "Tommy, you ready?" David called from downstairs. "Almost," Tommy called back, taking one last look at himself. The nervous, scared kid who used to sleep in doorways was gone. In his place stood a confident 14-year-old who had just been named valedictorian of his class and had received a full scholarship to continue at Riverside Academy through high school. But the biggest change wasn't in how he looked or where he lived. It was in how he felt about himself. For the first time since his mother died, Tommy felt like he belonged somewhere. He had friends at school who knew nothing about his past life on the streets, teachers who encouraged his writing and art, and most importantly, he had David. David hadn't just given Tommy a home. He'd given him a father. As Tommy walked down the curved staircase to the front hall, he saw David waiting for him in his best suit, holding a small wrapped package. "You look sharp, son," David said, and Tommy still got a warm feeling every time David called him that. "Ready for your big night?" "I think so. What's the package?" David smiled mysteriously. "Something I've been saving for the right moment. I think tonight qualifies." They drove to the school in comfortable silence, both of them thinking about how far they'd come together. Tommy remembered those first few weeks in David's house, how he'd been afraid to touch anything, how he'd kept his plastic bag of his mother's belongings hidden under his bed, because he was sure David would change his mind and send him away. But David had been patient. He'd never pushed Tommy to talk about his feelings or demanded gratitude for what he was doing. He'd simply been there, consistent and caring, until Tommy finally started to believe that this new life wasn't going to disappear. The scholarship ceremony was being held in the school's main auditorium, and Tommy was amazed to see how many people had come. Students, parents, teachers, and even some local business leaders who supported the scholarship program. As they found their seats, Tommy spotted his English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had encouraged him to submit his poetry to literary magazines. and Mr. Chen from the art department who had helped him develop his drawing skills. Nervous? David asked as they sat down. A little, Tommy admitted. I'm not used to being the center of attention. You'll do fine. Just speak from the heart like you always do. When Tommy's name was called and he walked up to the podium, he looked out at the audience and felt overwhelmed by how much his life had changed. He thought about his mother, wishing she could be there to see this moment. 2 years ago, Tommy began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I was living on the streets with nothing but a plastic bag full of memories. I thought my life was over before it had really begun. But then I met someone who showed me that sometimes the right thing to do is also the thing that changes everything. He glanced at David, who was watching with obvious pride. This scholarship isn't just about academic achievement, Tommy continued. It's about second chances and the people who believe in you even when you don't believe in yourself. It's about learning that your past doesn't define your future, but the choices you make today do. The audience applauded warmly as Tommy finished his speech and received his award. As he walked back to his seat, he saw David wiping his eyes with his handkerchief, trying to be discreet about it. After the ceremony, as people were milling around congratulating the winners and taking photos, David pulled Tommy aside. I'm incredibly proud of you, he said. Your mother would be too. Thanks, Dad, Tommy said, and David's face lit up the way it always did when Tommy called him that. It had taken Tommy almost a year to feel comfortable using the word, but now it felt as natural as breathing. Now seems like the perfect time for this, David said, handing Tommy the wrapped package he'd been carrying. Tommy unwrapped it carefully and found a leather-bound photo album, much nicer than the cheap drugstore album he'd kept his mother's pictures in. The cover was embossed with gold letters that read, "In memory of a beautiful life." David, this is beautiful, but I already have an album for Mom's photos. Open it, David said gently. Tommy opened the album and gasped. The first page contained his mother's letters, but they weren't the faded, fragile papers he'd been so carefully protecting. These had been professionally preserved and mounted behind protective glass. Her handwriting looked fresh and clear, as if she had just written them. You had them restored, Tommy whispered, turning the pages carefully. Every letter was there. Every photo had been enhanced and reprinted, and his own drawings and poems had been included too, professionally matted like they were valuable art pieces. There's something else, David said quietly. Something I found when I was helping to preserve everything. But I wanted to wait until you were older to tell you about it. Tommy looked up from the album. What do you mean? David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. It looked like some kind of official document, but Tommy couldn't make out what it was in the dim light of the auditorium lobby. When we were organizing your mother's letters to have them preserved, one of them felt thicker than the others. Inside the envelope with her last letter to you, there was this. David handed Tommy the paper, and Tommy's hand started shaking as he realized what he was looking at. It was a lottery ticket dated just 2 days before his mother's accident. I had it checked, David said softly. Tommy, your mother bought a winning lottery ticket and never knew it. She died before the drawing happened. Tommy stared at the ticket, not fully understanding. Winning? How much? $2.8 million. The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. He had to sit down on a nearby bench, still staring at the ticket in disbelief. She never knew, he whispered. All those times she worked double shifts. All those times she went without so I could have what I needed. And she had a winning ticket the whole time. She bought it the same day she wrote you that last letter, David said, sitting beside him. The one where she told you she was proud of the man you'd become, where she said that money wasn't what made people rich. Tommy started crying then. Not sad tears, but overwhelmed tears. She was carrying around millions of dollars and still gave me the last of her lunch money for my school trip. That's exactly the kind of person she was, Tommy. And that's exactly why she raised such an incredible son. David put his arm around Tommy's shoulders. The ticket belongs to you, of course. Her estate, your inheritance. But Tommy, I want you to understand something. This money doesn't change who you are or who you've become. You were already rich in all the ways that matter. Tommy wiped his eyes and looked at David. What do you mean? I mean, you had a mother who loved you enough to sacrifice everything for your happiness. You had character strong enough to return a briefcase when you were desperate. You had talent that would have shown itself with or without money to support it. The lottery ticket is nice, Tommy, but it's not what made you special. Tommy looked around the school lobby at his classmates and their families celebrating. He thought about his small room above the hardware store, his mother working late into the night, the plastic bag he'd carried through the streets. Then he thought about the past 2 years with David, the family they'd built together, the future stretching out ahead of him. "You know what's funny?" Tommy said finally. "What?" 2 years ago, if someone had told me I'd win the lottery, I would have thought that was the most amazing thing that could happen to me. But finding out about it now after everything, it's not even the best thing that's happened to me in the last 2 years. David smiled. What was the best thing? Tommy looked at his father, the man who had taken a chance on a homeless kid with nothing but a plastic bag full of memories. "Finding a family," Tommy said simply. "Money can't buy that." As they walked out of the school together, Tommy carefully tucked the lottery ticket into his jacket pocket, next to his mother's preserved letter. Both were valuable, both were precious, but only one of them had taught him how to live. The boy who had once chased down a businessman to return a lost briefcase had learned the most important lesson of all. The richest people aren't those who have the most money, but those who have the most love, and by that measure Tommy had been wealthy all along.